Adolf, thank you for agreeing to take part in this interview. It is part of INO's work on special issues of the International Journal of Disability and Social Justice, intended to mark 50 years of independent living in 2022. The topic of the interview and the special issue is independent living in Europe and beyond, past, present, and future. So let us start with some questions about the past and the lessons learned from 50 years of independent living advocacy. Can you tell me, how did you first learn about independent living and what was the impact on your life?
I have to disappoint you that it wasn't 50 years ago. Well, yeah, it may have been. It was, I moved to the States in 66 to California, and then in 73, in May 15, I still remember the date, I was visiting Berkeley, the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley, which at that time didn't exist yet. It was the physically disabled student services on campus, run by John Hessler, who was one of the so-called rolling quads. That is the group around Ed Roberts. And the group had persuaded and cajoled and forced the university to provide accommodations on campus for students with disabilities, and that PDSP, Physically Disabled Student Services, was the agency to implement these services for disabled students. The center, I understand, was incorporated a little bit later, and when I returned to Berkeley next time, we met for a Christmas party in the Center for Independent Living. I've forgotten the address, and that was the first time I met the expression independent living. But in my case, as in many other cases, the concept was clear before the word was there. And incidentally, I never thought that the word independent living was a fortunate choice, because it may make sense in the US. It does not make sense in Asia, where people don't want to be independent because that means you're away from anybody else. And it doesn't make so much sense in Europe either, because the individualistic tradition is not as strong yet as in the US. It would have been much better to decide on a term like self-determination. That's my favorite one, and I use it as often as I can. Self-determination. So the dates I already mentioned. So that was around the time I got through the concept. I practiced what we now call independent living since 66. June 66, I had a personal assistant. I was living on campus during the summer session at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. And all my time in the US, I had personal assistants. And I took with me, I had also personal assistants here when I moved to Sweden. That was it.
Mm-hmm. You've mentioned that you have been living independently, still using this term, before you came across the term. Did anything change afterwards? for you?
Oh, the term itself didn't change anything, but my lifestyle changed from living in, having lived 5 years, for 5 years, in a hospital ward, and then suddenly within a few weeks, almost living on campus among students of my age, in the 60s. That was mind-blowing. I wasn't used to that. Everybody else had long hair. I had short hair. I was behind the times. There's so much I didn't grasp. I just had to relearn everything. After having been in the hospital from the age of 17 to 22, there was a lot to catch up.
You've been at the right place at the right time, for that. Okay, and now thinking about advocacy, what were the biggest achievements and the biggest challenges you came across?
Well, to me, the independent living movement consists of two components. Only one of them is advocacy. That's not the whole thing. I mean, the traditional disability organizations, often there have been organizations for disabled people. They've done advocacy too. They've done it of ruining our image, depicting us as hopeless, helpless cripples who need pity and all that kind of crap. The other aspect I find much more important, and that is I see the independent living movement as a self-help movement in the traditional sense. And they use concepts such as peer support. Just think of the Alcoholic Anonymous. They use peer support. They support each other, meaning you share the fruits of your experience with other people, so they too can benefit from. They might not have to repeat all the mistakes you made. So that, I think, is very important, because hardly anybody does it. Not the traditional disability organizations, at least. So that, I think, is still very much neglected. Of course, it's much more fun to go to Brussels and meet some members of the European Parliament once or twice every second year. But that's not going to change that much. It's more important what we do at the grassroots level in our local areas, that we meet, that we exchange visits with people in other places abroad in different countries, that we learn from each other, that we have friends abroad and try and learn how in other countries social policy works or doesn't work, so we can learn. That's a lot more important than sending delegations to politicians who keep talking about the same thing. I'm getting sick and tired of all this talk about our rights, our rights, our rights. There is an inflation of people demanding rights. And then we've got the convention. It's on paper. But has anything changed? No. Our rights are still only on paper. Nobody has thought about, or not that many people, that these rights, in order to be implemented, need to be pursued, if necessary, in court. So some years back, I started what we call Disability Rights Defenders Network, for that purpose, to teach ourselves not only about our rights, but how to go about enforcing them in court. The other thing people never thought about is that, so the government ratified the convention, okay? They ratified the special protocol, the optional protocol, excellent, but that's it. I look at Sweden. Sweden hasn't done anything to make the convention become real. Anything, nothing. So what we need is to learn, how do you implement such a document? How do you force the government to adopt a plan with milestones, with criteria, what has to be achieved, with benchmarks, with a budget? How much does it cost? Nothing. Have they not devoted money for that? Well, then it's not serious. We cannot take that serious. And if you look at most of the countries, we cannot take them serious. And we haven't done our job. We have not taken ourselves serious. We've been naive, listening to the politicians who once a year or every second year say something nice. So we almost get tears in our eyes that somebody finally is understanding, but then nothing happens. No, we have to stop talking about rights and start enforcing mechanisms that forces our respective governments to go to action.
This moves us to the questions about the present, but just before that, I would like to ask you, has advocacy changed since the time, independent living advocacy, since the time your activism started?
Well, it's getting up higher and higher in the hierarchies.
Mm.
Now we're talking about Brussels, but Brussels didn't exist when we started the whole thing. Yeah, but it's become more prestigious, and there's travel involved, and people like to travel, including me. So it hasn't. That has changed, but not the results. Nothing has. Not so much. Not so much.
Okay. So are you saying that it's more formal, more about directly addressing politicians than having protests and mobilizations?
Well, the grassroots work could have been a lot more intensive. There could have been a lot more activism on the local level with, as I said, people twinning with other cities, with other in Europe, or visiting each other, learning from each other. That aspect that hasn't been developed so much. What I do see there is a tendency, well, I'm talking about the present now, but I say it anyway, so that is the division into different groups. For example, of course, it's nice if young people meet each other, but the whole idea is to be a network and not to exclude people, for example, when they get older. Where should the young people, from whom shall the young people learn something, if not from the older folks who have been in this business for longer and made their mistakes and also made some successes, so they can teach the younger generations what can go wrong and how do you avoid that.
And you mentioned also the convention. How do you assess the role of the convention for independent living advocacy?
Well, it is it depends who looks at it. For example, many people of us, and including me in the beginning, I thought, wow, what a wonderful document. Our language, wonderful. Yeah, it was on paper, and nothing has changed in countries like Sweden, for example. So a lot of people are not used to that kind of stuff. A lot of people think their rights will be automatically implemented when you can wave a piece of paper where they're written on. But that's not the case. Only when you can take things to court, only then you have rights. And even then, it takes years and lots of time and money to push them through, to get them into reality. And that I don't see that many places. In most countries, the ratification process has been the weakest possible. As I said before, in Sweden, the government did not find it necessary to change a single law or add a single law because of the convention. No, that was not necessary, they thought. And that attitude is quite widespread, that people believe it's a piece of paper, now it's up to the politicians. Well, they couldn't care less if there's no pressure. So we got to pressure them. And we got to pressure them in certain directions, as I said before. We need to force them to adopt these mechanisms, these periodic reviews, these, as I said, benchmarks, budgets, all that kind of stuff. If we don't do this, we are naive.
So the convention could be a helpful instrument.
In time, but as it is phrased now in most countries, the way it's ratified, it's not an instrument that can be used in court yet.
Yeah.
In some countries, but in most countries not.
Yeah. Okay, so moving to the present, what are the main tasks of independent living advocacy at present? What do you think?
Well, it is a continuation of what I just said before. It turns out that in the European Union, the most powerful instrument we have are the directives, the EU directives. I'm thinking of, for example, the one about coaches and buses. Sweden had no interest whatsoever to buy the appropriate buses. But because it was member of the European Union and because of the directive that was passed, it was forced to buy only buses that are accessible. So without the European Union, Sweden would be, the public transportation system would be still pretty much inaccessible. Well, not completely, because no bus producer can produce buses that are inaccessible now and sell them. Because of the directive, all countries have to purchase accessible buses. So, but my point is that if we had a look at the convention and tried to reformulate the convention in appropriate smaller pieces and form directives, transform the total convention into a series of directives and try to get them adopted, that would be a powerful tool. Because that way we could avoid having it depend on each single country whether they ratified it in the right way or not. I mean, the only way to really enforce the convention is to make it by law a piece of your own legislation, of your own national legislation. And that has not been happened, for example, in Sweden. But a directive becomes immediately a piece of the national legislation. So that would be my advice, how to form a strategy for future advocacy.
Mhm. And thinking about your country, what are the current barriers to independent living in Sweden at the moment?
Well, there are quite a few, of course. There is a widespread ignorance about the living conditions of people with disabilities who need assistance in the activities of daily living. They either live in families or they live in institutions. Now, of course, Swedes would say, no, this is not an institution. This is a group home. There live 4 to 5 people there. They haven't read the Article 19, and especially they haven't read General Comment number 5. So group homes, whatever you call it, as long as you have to share the workers with other residents there, as long as you cannot have your own personal assistant that you employ yourself and still live in that place, if you like it for some reason, it's still an institution. And I met people on Facebook from the movement. I was flabbergasted, a person being on the board of the cooperative that I started way back in the 80s that introduced personal assistance to Sweden. This person, a young fellow who never lived in an institution, says in this Facebook correspondence that, oh yeah, group homes are not institutions. So, I mean, if the ignorance has come so far that even our supposedly own movement is not aware of that, what can you expect from people on the street? They are not, you cannot accuse them of anything if we ourselves do the same thing. So ignorance is a big thing. And ignorance also about the mechanism, how to go about and how to claim your rights in court. And then, of course, you have the various other things. There's always competition for money. And our groups have traditionally not been prioritized. To put it mildly, we are not assumed to yell very loud when people step on our feet. And we usually keep quiet and just don't make much noise. And we have not much influence.
So is this about self-organization, disabled people in Sweden being not that united, or?
Well, we have very much the traditional division of the movement by diagnosis.
Mm.
Except for 1 or 2 groups, they are still along medical lines. So if you open up the magazines, they will write about cures and treatment for this and that. And of course, more money, always more money. But no, it's difficult to have unity with groups that where each group organization fights for their own money for cures and research for their particular ailment. And there are new groups coming up every year and want to get money from the government for their particular ailment.
I see. Yeah. Again, still about the present, there's been a lot going on in the recent years with COVID and the war in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, and the cost of living crisis. How these issues have affected the independent living advocacy in Sweden in particular, more broadly as well?
Well, our working conditions, of course, have changed. Doing things more virtually than physically, well, that's everywhere else in other fields as well. But, and of course, it was amazing to see the acceptance by the Swedish government to spend a lot more money for defense. All of a sudden, those billions of crowns were available. And when we say that people should have personal assistance, there's no money. So that has made it much more difficult for us to claim our needs and get them funded. I'm painting a very negative picture here. I don't like this so that much, but right now that's.
Yeah.
We have elections coming up in a couple of weeks. I never see the word disability in the discussions. There's about immigration. That means we don't need those immigrants. There is crime. We have a sad record in the European Union of most people per capita being murdered on the streets. We have that kind of stuff that's in the news. But disability and equal rights, well, you can't wake up anybody with that.
So it's been difficult to put disability issues on the political agenda, and it seems that in the current context, it's becoming more so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, probably now is the right time to move a bit towards the future and think about what is the future of independent living in Europe and beyond. What do you think is the future of independent living?
Well, if I look at the situation in the US, where things started, and they were about, well, at least 20, 30 years ahead of us in that development. If I look at the US, my impression is that the independent living movement is established at each state level. They receive state money for the work they're doing, and in many states consider themselves as the prolonged arm of the state government, having been sort of institutionalized. And I don't like the word institution. And in that context, I don't like it at all. So there have been reports of people demonstrating in the streets, and the centers for, or some centers for independent living, forbidding their employees to take part in these demonstrations. Because they were, of course, against the state government or some other authority. And you don't want to bite the hand that feeds you. So I sure hope we don't follow that development. And to see a positive development that we could follow, I don't see that right now.
Invent a new, not follow, but
No, I shouldn't, I have to correct myself. In some countries, the movement actually has been successful, very much so. I look, for example, at Germany. The movement has built a fantastic infrastructure. They have their own news agency, Robinet, for the German-speaking countries like Germany, Austria, Switzerland. They have ratified the convention in apparently a more powerful way, because it's been becoming more often used in the courts, in court decisions, development that I haven't seen here yet. So they've come quite a bit there. And the movement has taken over, has become a recognized partner by the federal government, which we cannot claim at all in Sweden and most other countries. So Germany, in that respect, could be good. And they have been so busy with themselves, so they have not really cared so much about the European network. So Germany would be a good place for study visits to see how they've been doing and how they are doing their work.
And what strategies shall independent living activists in Europe adopt in terms of, for example, national or international or consensus, confrontational, or disability focused or intersectional along these lines? You talked about some of these things, but if you would like to say something more with a look into the future, what do you think would be more successful?
Well, I think it would make a lot of sense if we, as a movement, had closer and wider connections with the legal community, law professors, law students, pro bono lawyers who are getting more and more interested in human rights, but mainly human rights when it comes to immigration, but not to disability. We haven't been sexy enough to lawyers in that respect. So that I hope that would give us some advantages to have at least more access to pro bono lawyers, because it's expensive to claim your rights in court. And even pro bono is not this perfect solution, because pro bono lawyers have to first work for those jobs that get paid for, which means that if they take your case pro bono, then you have to wait until they have time to work with you. So the law, I mean, that is, I hope, the avenue to the future, to a better future. I mean, I still find it outrageous that nobody has taken the European Union to court by letting country governments abuse the funds, the European funds. I mean, Jeremy Quinn, when he was still law professor in Galway, had published a report way back, at least 10, 15 years ago, about the illegality of using European social fund money and the structural funds for maintaining institutions, and had warned very clearly that both the respective national government, but also the Commission itself, could be taken to court. Nothing has happened. Nobody has done it.
Yeah, did try, made some steps, but the case was not recognized as admissible, I think, so it did not really reach, wasn't really reviewed. And what is the role of younger generation of independent living activists in the future of independent living advocacy?
Well, you use the word advocacy all the time, and I don't, because as I said before, we have to have at least two legs to stand on. One is the advocacy, sure, but other people doing that too, and some of them do actually very good work. What we could do better, what other people don't do, is, as I said, this supporting each other on the local level as a typical self-help organization, because it is still quite a challenge to grow up in a society where people claim that your life is not worth living because you're disabled. Where every country, many countries now adopt legislation that make it easier and easier to kill persons with disabilities if they wish to do so. And how much they do it, they want to kill them, get killed by their own will, or how much they're under pressure is not so sure. It's a very difficult question. But the message is clear: your life is not worth living. During this COVID business, I was compelled to write a debating article in a Swedish daily paper saying that if I were to be if I would fall ill or had an accident and would end up in the emergency or intensive care unit without being able to speak, and people just would look at me, a bundle of bones with skin, and getting old too. I'm 78 now. I mean, the chances that they would really do their best to keep me alive, these chances are very small. And I'm not talking only for myself. The COVID has shown, especially here in Sweden in the beginning, that all the people summarily, instead of getting treatment, getting oxygen, or getting something to drink, they were moved over to into palliative care without having been seen even by a doctor. So the respect for people with disabilities, especially when they get older, is not there. So this is dangerous. And young people growing up in such a society, they get all these signals. Okay, they're still not old yet, but they are in for a surprise when society increasingly devalues their lives. So that they ought to be prepared for that, and we ought to have worked more for adapting the society to be open for us, regardless of age, and so that we could be included, regardless of age.
I guess this also involves what you've mentioned, like peer support, but also towards younger people, but also in terms of making them more aware about how the society is shaping disabled people understanding and self-perception and how to counter this.
Yeah. And the paradoxical thing is that I wasn't aware of these mechanisms either to that extent. I remember that I used to demonstrate too against the tradition of, could almost call it tradition of putting young people into nursing homes for old people, for lack of anything else. No, young people shouldn't belong in nursing homes. What we should have said is, nobody should have to go into nursing homes. Nobody. That's what we should have said. No, we were concentrated on ourselves. We were still young. And yeah, and now it's still the same thing, that when you get older, at a certain age, that's probably the only place you can end up with. Unless you have personal assistance, and who has that?
Yeah. So this is also probably one way in which disability advocacy has changed over the year, from becoming more broader.
Well, I hope so, but I don't see it. I don't see it. I mean, the emphasis is still on youth. Why not? Why doesn't ANIL have an oldies network now that they have a youth network?
And do you want to say anything else before we stop recording? Is there anything else that I forgot to ask you about?
Oh, there's probably lots of things, but right now I cannot think of much.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Adolf. Really great to be able to have this interview with you for the special issue. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your good questions.